Welcome back to The Explainer. It's a truly fascinating intersection we're looking at today. Human psychology, religious history, and medieval power. Have you ever wondered why human societies are just so absolutely obsessed with creating rules? Or why institutions throughout history fight tooth and nail to enforce them? Well, to understand those massive, sweeping historical battles between kings and bishops, we actually have to start by looking inward, right inside our own minds.
It really is a question that completely defines our modern era. Why are humans so deeply divided? Now, it's super tempting to think our divisions just come down to intelligence or access to information, or maybe just plain stubbornness. But based on our sources today, I want to pitch a different angle to you. What if we're divided not by what we know, but by our tolerance for uncertainty? What if the absolute root of human conflict is simply how much ambiguity we can stomach before we desperately need the world to make sense again?
Okay, let's dive into this core concept, destabilization and tolerance. Look, at some point, we all face massive destabilizing questions, right? Things like death, randomness, meaning, and injustice. And these aren't just abstract puzzles, they create actual, palpable psychological strain. Destabilization and tolerance is the inability to just sit with that prolonged uncertainty. When that strain gets to be too much, our minds urgently seek closure. We construct rigid narratives, strict moral rules, and incredibly powerful authorities. We literally do this to create a kind of anxiety regulator. It makes reality survivable and basically allows us to function day to day. Which brings us to this really powerful quote that serves as the central thesis for our whole explainer today. Human belief systems are not optimized for truth. They are optimized for regulation. Really think about that for a second. The rigid structures we see everywhere in society, whether we're talking about religious doctrines, political ideologies, or intense national identities, they don't exist primarily to perfectly explain the universe. No, they exist to manage our collective anxiety and keep the group together. They draw a hard, sharp line between right and wrong, specifically to stop dangerous inquiry before it fractures society.
So, here is the roadmap for how we're going to unpack this today. First, the craving for certainty. Second, how rules become power. Third, the church versus the crown. Fourth, seizing the temporalities. Fifth, a pattern of submission. And finally, number 6, a world without dogma.
Let's get right into section 1, the craving for certainty, and why we actually need rules. So when destabilization totally exceeds what we can handle, we naturally gravitate towards systems that offer certainty and a sense of belonging. Religion, politics, and dogmatic rule sets act as these essential anxiety regulators. They literally reduce our cognitive load. I mean, think about it. If the rules tell you exactly how to live, you don't have to endlessly calculate the morality of every single action you take. This isn't a glitch in human design, it's a feature. It's a fundamental survival function. It provides answers where none are otherwise accessible, which preserves psychological stability for massive groups of people so they can actually stay aligned and cooperative.
Let's move to section 2 and see how this builds. How rules become power and the evolution of ethics.
Let's look at the evolution of Judeo-Christian sexual ethics as a prime example of how rules adapt to preserve stability. If we map out this timeline, it becomes super clear that moral rules are not static. They breathe, expanding and contracting under pressure. Back in ancient Israel, sexual rules focused heavily on tribal lineage, inheritance, and property, things like permitting polygamy but forbidding adultery as a literal property violation. Then, under the intense cultural threat of empires during the Second Temple era, rules really tightened up to preserve a distinct identity. Fast forward to the Christianization of the Roman Empire, and sex suddenly becomes a matter of state and church, with monogamy being legally enforced. By the medieval era, these rules morphed into highly structured institutional and sacramental laws. And finally, jumping to our modern era of industrialization and individualism, we see a massive shift toward personal autonomy, with different churches interpreting morality in vastly different ways today. And this brilliantly illustrates the structural connection between our psychological anxiety and institutional control. See, rules aren't just arbitrary. They loosen up when individuals feel autonomous, when institutions are relatively weak, and when pluralism is high. But they snap back and tighten aggressively whenever identity is threatened, when institutions need to consolidate power, or when social cohesion is just desperately needed to prevent a total collapse. Doctrine hardens when authority needs stability. Moving on to section 3, the church v. the crown. What happens when these massive systems clash? To really see this dynamic in action, let's scale down from millennia of history into the micro-level legal battles of 14th century medieval England. Right at the center of this clash was something called episcopal temporalities.
Basically, these were vast secular estates. We're talking manors, castles, and sprawling lands that the king granted to bishops. These lands were absolutely crucial. They provided the massive wealth needed to actually run church administration. But because they were granted by the crown, they carried heavy feudal duties, like mandatory military service. The English kings realized this was their ultimate leverage point. They used these temporalities as a giant carrot to control who got appointed to church positions, and more importantly, seizing these lands became a devastating royal weapon to punish any bishop who dared to step out of line.
Which brings us to Section 4, Seizing the Temporalities, a 14th century microhistory.
To really understand how this weapon was wielded, we can look at 3 very specific, dramatic cases. First up, Bishop John Grandison of Exeter. He refused to accept the king's nominee for a church position. The king's response? He seized Grandison's temporalities for over a year, until the bishop finally yielded and paid a hefty 200-mark fine. Then there's Thomas de Lisle, Bishop of Ely. Now this is pretty wild for a bishop. He actually harbored murderers and directly challenged the king's judicial authority. The crown showed absolutely no mercy, fully confiscating his properties. Lisle fled to Avignon and died without ever getting them back. Finally, William of Wykeham, Bishop of Winchester, was targeted for purely political reasons by the powerful Duke of Lancaster, John of Gaunt. Wykeham faced a massive fine and exile, only recovering his estates when political tides shifted under a brand new king. So the crucial point is that this was a deeply entrenched system of political leverage. Now let's look at Section 5, a pattern of submission and negotiated obedience. You see, these weren't just isolated historical dramas. They actually reveal a highly institutionalized pattern of how authorities force submission to maintain control. The crown developed a very reliable 3-step dance to constrict the church's privileges. Step 1, seizure. The king asserts absolute supremacy by taking the bishop's lands, instantly cutting off their financial lifeline. Step 2, negotiation. The desperate bishop is forced to the table, offering hefty monetary fines, admitting fault, and pledging political loyalty. And Step 3, conditional restitution. The crown hands the lands back, but the dynamic has fundamentally changed. The bishop is now demonstrably, permanently subordinate.
This connects perfectly back to our core psychological concept today. Just as the human mind creates rules to regulate anxiety, the king acted as the ultimate anxiety regulator for the medieval realm. By forcing the church into this negotiated obedience, the crown ensured that the systems governing society were stable, predictable, and firmly under state control. The rules hardened precisely because the king's authority required it to survive.
And that leads us to our final section, number 6, A World Without Dogma, the ultimate thought experiment.
Now, what's really interesting about this thought experiment is asking, what if humanity simply outgrew this psychological crutch? What if we actually became capable of comfortably holding uncertainty? If we didn't need immediate closure, major conflict dynamics would just collapse, because someone disagreeing with you wouldn't feel like an existential threat to your identity anymore. Religion wouldn't disappear, but it would likely transform from dogmatic enforcement into philosophical exploration. Politics would stop being a tribal identity defense and become actual outcomes-based engineering. Truth-seeking would accelerate massively because there would be no forbidden conclusions left to protect our egos. We would teach our kids how to manage uncertainty, rather than just memorizing rigid answers. Meaning would be constructed consciously rather than just blindly inherited.
But there is a massive trade-off here. Certainty is a fuel. It drives moral urgency, it motivates action, and it makes collective coordination incredibly efficient. If we remove that destabilization and tolerance, society becomes vastly more honest, yes, for sure, but it might also become a lot slower to act. It wouldn't necessarily be a more comfortable society. We would have to consciously build our own meaning every single day without a handy rulebook to fall back on. But it would undoubtedly be a much more mature one.
Which leaves us with this final profound question to consider today. Look at the structures, the rules, and the certainties you rely on in your own life. Are we, as a society, finally ready to face reality without flinching, to hold the discomfort of the unknown? Or, deep down, do we still desperately need the world to lie to us just so we can get out of bed in the morning? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I will catch you next time.